The planet of Lionar was quiet that evening, its twin moons casting a soft blue light over the endless desert plains. In this vast expanse, Zira wandered, her steps cautious and her delicate hands outstretched. Her species, the Tholurians, were born without sight, but with heightened senses that helped them navigate their world. Yet tonight, Zira felt lost. The shifting sands gave no clues to her position, and the wind carried no familiar scents to guide her back to her village. Zira was different from others in her village, where they accepted their blindness as a natural part of life. She often wondered what it might be like to see. She had heard stories of sighted beings in other parts of the galaxy, beings who could describe colors, shapes, and even the stars. For Zira, it was like imagining an entirely new sense, one that her mind could barely grasp. As she stumbled over a hidden rock, her sharp ears caught a faint noise in the distance. It was not the wind or the hum of the desert creatures. It was mechanical, metal against metal, steady and rhythmic. Curious and cautious, Zira followed the sound. Meanwhile, Theo crouched beside the wreckage of his small spacecraft, muttering under his breath. The crash landing on this unfamiliar planet had been rough, but at least he was alive. His tools were scattered, and his food supplies were limited, but Theo was resourceful. A human engineer and medical researcher, he was used to solving problems, even in the harshest conditions. "This engine won't fix itself," he said to no one in particular, wiping sweat from his brow. The desert heat was oppressive, and the two moons provided little relief. As he worked, Theo suddenly noticed a figure approaching in the distance. He froze, his instincts kicking in. Out here, he had no idea what kind of creatures lived on this planet. Grabbing a small device from his toolkit, a scanner capable of detecting life signs, he pointed it toward the figure. To his surprise, the readings were similar to a humanoid's. The figure moved cautiously, and as it came closer, Theo realized it was a woman, or at least a being who resembled one. Her skin was a shimmering silver, and her movements were graceful yet hesitant. She wore flowing garments that blended seamlessly with the desert sands. "Hello," Theo called out, raising a hand in greeting. Zira froze at the sound of the voice. It was deep and unfamiliar, with an accent she had never heard before. Her enhanced hearing told her that the speaker was standing by some kind of machine, but she couldn't determine his intentions. "I'm not here to hurt you," Theo said, stepping forward slowly. He noticed her blindfold, a simple cloth tied over her eyes. "Are you lost?" Zira hesitated, then nodded. "I cannot find my way back to my village," she replied. Her voice was soft and melodic, though tinged with uncertainty. Theo's translator chip kicked in, interpreting her words perfectly. "I can help," he said, lowering the scanner and gesturing toward her. "Do you trust me?" Zira tilted her head, her other senses analyzing him. His voice held no malice, and his movements were calm. She took a cautious step closer. "You are not from this planet," she said. "Your voice, it is strange." "You're right," Theo replied with a small smile. "I'm human. My ship crashed here. I'm just trying to survive." He paused, studying her. "What's your name?" "Zira," she said simply. "And yours?" "Theo." He glanced at the horizon, where the moons hung low. "We should find shelter. It's getting colder." Zira nodded, and together they set off toward the nearest rocky outcrop. As they walked, Theo kept glancing at her. Her movements were careful and deliberate, as if she were feeling the ground with each step. It fascinated him. "Can I ask, why do you wear the blindfold?" Theo asked after a while. "I do not see," Zira replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "My people are born without vision. We rely on our other senses to live." Theo frowned. He had heard of species with unique adaptations, but blindness, an entire civilization that had never known sight. The scientist in him was intrigued. "That must be difficult," he said gently. "It is what we are," Zira replied. "But I have often wondered, what it would be like to see, to know light, color, the sky. Theo's curiosity deepened. He decided not to press further for now, sensing that Zira was not used to discussing such things. When they reached the outcrop, Theo set up a small portable shelter from his crash kit. It was a simple structure, but it would shield them from the cold desert winds. Zira sat quietly, her head tilted toward the sound of Theo's movements as he worked. "Thank you," she said softly. Theo paused, looking at her. "For what?" "For helping me. You didn't have to." He smiled. "Well, Zira, I think we're both a little lost out here. Maybe we can help each other." As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle above, Zira and Theo sat by the shelter. For the first time in her life, Zira felt a spark of hope, a sense that perhaps this strange human might bring something new to her world. The desert night was cold, the winds howling softly through the rocky landscape. Zira sat close to the fire Theo had built, the warmth of the flames a welcome contrast to the chill. Theo worked silently beside her, his hands moving with skill as he repaired some of his equipment. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hum of his tools. Zira watched him closely, her sharp hearing picking up the steady rhythm of his movements. She had never met a human before, and though she still wasn't sure what to make of him, she felt an odd sense of comfort in his presence. His calmness was something she wasn't used to. Her people, the Tholarians, were often quick to act, guided by their senses and intuition. But Theo was different. He moved deliberately, as if he thought through each action before carrying it out. It made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Are you always this quiet?" Theo asked, breaking the silence. He glanced over at her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Zira tilted her head. "I listen more than I speak," she replied. Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of curiosity in it. "I have learned that silence often carries more than words." Theo smiled, intrigued by her words. "I've never met anyone who thinks like that. You Tholarians, I've read about your species, but there's so much I don't understand." "Not many humans know of us," Zira said, her voice thoughtful. "We have little contact with other species. Our blindness is both a gift and a curse. We rely on our senses of hearing, touch, and smell to navigate our world. Vision, as you call it, is foreign to us." Theo nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. He had heard of the Tholarians before, but only in passing. They were a rare species, known for their ability to sense things beyond what most other beings could, but he hadn't realized just how different their way of life was. "So, you don't miss sight?" he asked, unsure how to phrase the question. "I mean, I can't imagine not seeing anything at all." Zira paused for a moment, considering the question. "I have never known anything else," she said. "In my world, seeing is not something we do. We are connected to the land through our senses. I can feel the wind on my skin, hear the songs of the birds, smell the flowers as they bloom. These are my truths. Sight is a foreign concept." Theo was fascinated by her words. For Zira, the world was a tapestry of sound, touch, and smell, things that he could only begin to imagine. He wondered what it would be like to live in a world where sight wasn't even a possibility, where the colors of the sky and the shape of the mountains didn't matter. "I suppose that makes sense," Theo said slowly. "But still, there must be times when you wonder what it would be like to see." Zira nodded again. "There are times," she admitted, "when I hear stories of the stars and the skies. I feel the longing. I wish I could understand what they look like. I've seen humans and other beings who see their world with their eyes. It is different." Theo smiled softly, the idea of Zira's longing pulling at something deep inside him. "I think I can help with that." Zira raised an eyebrow. "Help me see?" Theo nodded. "I've been working on a device. It's not perfect, but it might help you experience sight. It won't be like how humans see, but it could give you a sense of what the world looks like." Zira was quiet for a moment, unsure whether to believe him. "Why would you help me?" she asked softly. "You are not of my kind. I'm a stranger to you." Theo turned to face her, his expression serious. "Because I think everyone deserves to see the world as they wish. And because I think you have something to teach me too." Zira was taken aback by his honesty. She had never met anyone quite like Theo, someone willing to help without expecting anything in return. In her world, most people did things for a reason, for personal gain. But Theo was different. "I don't know what to say," Zira replied, her voice full of uncertainty. "I've never thought about vision the way you do. It feels impossible, like trying to touch the stars." Theo smiled gently. "It's not impossible. It just takes time. And a little trust." Zira thought about his words. She had always felt that the universe had a way of showing her what she needed to know, though not always in the way she expected. Maybe Theo was part of that plan, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. "All right," she said at last, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll trust you." Theo's eyes lit up with hope. "Great. I'll start working on it tomorrow. But tonight we rest. We've both been through a lot." Zira nodded and settled back against the shelter, closing her eyes. The fire crackled beside them, casting warm shadows across the desert floor. As the sounds of the night filled the air, Zira felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, she felt a connection to something bigger than herself. It was as if her journey had just begun, and this strange human, Theo, was part of it. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the desert. Zira sat on the edge of their small shelter, her head tilted as she listened to the sounds of the desert awakening. The wind rustled through the sands, and the distant calls of birds echoed in the air. It was a familiar sound, but today, it felt different. Today, Theo had promised to start working on the device that might help her see. Theo had been busy all morning, unpacking his tools and examining the broken equipment he'd salvaged from the wreckage of his ship. He had told Zira that he would build something, a device that could somehow translate the world around her into something her mind could understand. He hadn't given many details, but the excitement in his voice had been enough to fill her with a strange sense of hope. She had never imagined that something like this could happen to her. Vision, real sight, was a dream she had kept hidden in her heart, something she thought was impossible. Yet Theo believed it was possible, and that belief, more than anything, gave her the courage to trust him. "Are you ready?" Theo called from behind her, his voice filled with quiet excitement. Zira turned toward him, feeling the shift in the air as he approached. She had spent the last few hours thinking about what he had said. It was hard to believe that a device could give her the ability to see, but Theo seemed so sure of it. She had nothing to lose by trying. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Theo smiled and handed her a small device. It was compact, with wires and small sensors attached to the sides. It didn't look like much, but Zira could tell it had been carefully crafted. "This will connect to your mind," he explained, "and help you experience what's around you. It won't be the same as sight for humans, but it will give you a way to interpret the world visually." Zira held the device in her hands, feeling the cool metal and the delicate sensors. It was strange to think that something so small could change her life forever. She didn't know exactly what to expect, but she trusted Theo. "Just place it here," Theo said gently, guiding her to place the device at her temple, just above her right ear. Zira obeyed, closing her eyes as the device made contact. She could feel a light hum, a gentle vibration, as it powered on. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her mind began to perceive something new. A flood of sensations filled her consciousness, images, colors, and patterns that she couldn't fully understand. They were like flashes of light, brief and fragmented, as if the world was trying to show itself to her, but not quite succeeding. It was overwhelming. Zira gasped, her heart racing. She could feel the shapes around her, like shadows in the distance, but they didn't make sense. The world felt disjointed and strange, like an incomplete puzzle. Theo quickly noticed her discomfort. "It's okay," he said, his voice soothing. "You're experiencing it for the first time. Take it slow." Zira took deep breaths, focusing on the sensations. The world around her seemed to shimmer in her mind. Flickering lights, abstract shapes, and strange patterns that didn't quite come together. She realized that what she was seeing was more than just visual. It was a blend of colors, movements, and energy, like an unfamiliar language her brain was struggling to decode. "Don't be afraid," Theo's voice broke through the confusion. "Just let it come to you." Zira focused on his voice, allowing herself to relax. Slowly, the flashes of light began to stabilize. She could make out the shape of Theo in front of her. His outline was blurry at first, but gradually it began to sharpen, like a blurry photograph coming into focus. She could see the colors of his clothing, the earthy brown of his jacket, the dull gray of his pants. She could sense the warmth of his presence and the faint shadow of his form in the space around him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "Zira," Theo asked, his voice filled with gentle concern. "How does it feel?" Zira opened her eyes, though the world around her still seemed a little fuzzy. "It's strange," she said quietly, her voice full of wonder. "It's like pieces of the world are coming to life. But I can't fully understand it yet." Theo nodded. "That's okay. It's going to take time for your mind to adjust. Just give it a little more time, and we'll make the connection stronger." Zira tried to relax, focusing on the sensations, letting them flow through her. She began to understand more. The shape of the ground beneath her, the rough texture of the rocks, the soft curve of the sand dunes in the distance. It was all there, just waiting for her to interpret it. With every passing moment, the world began to look more and more like something she could grasp. There were no sharp edges or clear lines, but there was an underlying structure, a rhythm to it all. It wasn't perfect sight, but it was something close to it. "I can see the shapes," Zira said, her voice full of awe. "The shapes of things. The air feels different. The wind. I can see it move." Theo watched her closely, his heart swelling with hope. "That's amazing, Zira. You're doing great." Zira smiled, feeling the strange warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in her life, she could experience the world in a way she had never thought possible. It wasn't the same as seeing, but it was enough. She looked around, trying to make sense of the new world in front of her. The desert stretched out before her, and for the first time, it didn't feel so empty. It felt alive, full of shapes and patterns, all waiting for her to understand. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "I can see it, Theo." Theo's smile grew wider. "This is just the beginning, Zira. You're going to be able to do so much more with this." Zira nodded, the excitement in her heart growing. She had no idea where this journey would lead, but for the first time, she felt like anything was possible. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Zira. At first, the new sensations from the device were overwhelming. But as time passed, she began to understand more. Theo had been patient with her, explaining the process and offering gentle encouragement when things became too confusing. Little by little, the strange flashes of color and light became more like a picture in her mind, a picture she could almost touch. One morning, Zira woke to find that Theo had built a small device, an upgrade to the one she was already using. It was larger, with more sensors and delicate wires wrapped carefully around a small core. "I've been working on something new," Theo said, his voice full of excitement. "This will help you see more clearly. The first device was just to get you started, but this one should give you a better connection. I think it'll help." Zira blinked, her heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and nerves. She was still getting used to the first device, and now there was something new to try. But she trusted Theo. If he believed it would work, then she would trust him. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice sincere. Theo smiled and placed the new device gently in her hands. It was heavier than the first one, and its sleek design felt unfamiliar against her skin. "It's a little more complicated," he warned, "but I'm here to help." Zira nodded and took a deep breath. She placed the new device at her temple, just as Theo had shown her. The moment it connected, she felt a shift. A slight hum in her mind, then a sudden flood of information. This time, it was different. The flashes of light became clearer, like a series of small, moving images. There were edges she could now trace with her mind. She gasped. It wasn't like sight, not exactly, but it was close. She could see the world in a way she had never imagined. The rough texture of the rocks, the delicate flow of the wind, the way the air shimmered over the sand. It was all there, a detailed map of her surroundings. It felt as though she could touch it with her thoughts. "How does it feel?" Theo asked, his voice filled with concern as he watched her. Zira took a few moments to adjust to the new sensation. The world was coming into focus, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't clear like human vision, but it was something different, something unique. The shapes and movements of everything around her formed a pattern that spoke to her in ways words could not. I think I understand it," Zira said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's like a map, like I can feel the world through my thoughts. I can see the shapes, the air, the heat." Theo's eyes sparkled with pride. "That's amazing, Zira. You're doing great. You're seeing more than you ever thought possible." Zira smiled, the excitement in her chest growing. She had always longed for this, longed to understand the world in a way that was different from her people. But this wasn't just sight, it was something more. It was a connection to the world, a deeper understanding of everything around her. Over the next few weeks, Theo and Zira worked together to improve the device. Zira spent more and more time exploring the world through this new sense. She learned to see the patterns in the wind, the movement of the clouds above, and the way the desert sands shifted with each passing hour. It was as if the entire planet was alive, breathing with her. But it wasn't always easy. There were times when the new sensations became too much for Zira. The flood of information, the constant barrage of patterns and shapes, would overwhelm her. When that happened, Theo was always there, guiding her through it, helping her to calm her mind and focus. "You're doing better than I ever expected," Theo told her one evening as they sat beside the fire. "The device is working even better than I thought it would. You're learning how to use it in ways I didn't imagine." Zira smiled at him, grateful for his support. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Theo looked at her, his expression soft. "You'd figure it out. You're strong, Zira. You've always had that strength. You just didn't know it yet." Zira looked up at the stars, her heart filled with a sense of wonder. For so long, she had felt lost in the world, as if she were a part of it, but not truly connected. Now, everything had changed. She could feel the stars above her, the earth beneath her, and the wind that flowed across the desert. The world was no longer a mystery. It was a puzzle she could begin to solve. But as much as Zira was learning, she still had questions. What would happen next? Could she ever truly understand the way sight worked for humans? Would she always be different, using this strange device to see a world? And what about Theo? He had been so kind, so patient with her, but he was still a human, and she was still a Thalariel. What did their futures hold? One evening, as they sat in silence, Zira decided to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Theo," she began, her voice soft and uncertain, "do you ever wonder if this will ever be enough?" Theo turned toward her, his face serious but gentle. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been able to see more than I ever thought possible," Zira said, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "But I'm still not like you. I'm still not truly like the humans I've heard of. I'll never see the way you do." Theo reached over, placing a hand gently on hers. "Zira, you're already more than you know. You've seen things I could never imagine. And what you see, what you experience, it's more than just sight. It's something unique, something special. Zira looked down at the ground, unsure. But I'm different. Theo smiled softly, the warmth in his voice reassuring. Maybe we're all a little different, but that doesn't make us any less important. It just makes us who we are. Zira met his gaze, the flicker of understanding crossing her mind. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Zira's connection to the world grew stronger. With each passing day, she was learning more about the strange new way of experiencing reality. Theo was by her side, always encouraging her, helping her when the flood of sensations became overwhelming. He had become more than just someone helping her with the device. He had become her friend. The sun rose early that morning, casting long shadows across the desert. Zira stood on a small cliff, looking out over the endless sea of sand and rocks. The wind blew gently through her hair, the sound of it filling her mind. The landscape, once just a blur of shapes and colors, was now taking on more meaning. The sand shifted with the breeze, the mountains in the distance cast long shadows, and the sky stretched on forever, like an ocean of stars waiting to be explored. She could see it now, not with human eyes, but with her mind, a tapestry of shapes and movements. It was as if the world was a living thing, and she was learning its language. She had begun to see things that no one else could, patterns in the wind, the way the earth shifted beneath her feet, the subtle changes in the air around her. "Are you ready?" Theo's voice broke her concentration. Zira turned to see him standing behind her, his face full of determination. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. He had been preparing for something important. A journey into the heart of the desert, to find the next part of his broken ship. They needed to repair it before they could leave. Zira nodded, her heart quickening at the thought of the journey ahead. She wasn't sure what they would find, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The desert was a harsh place, and they had already been through so much together. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Theo gave a small nod and started moving toward the pack they had prepared. He handed Zira a small water canteen, which she accepted gratefully. They didn't know how long the journey would take, but they were prepared for the worst. Together, they set off into the desert, walking side by side. The sun beat down on them, but Zira could feel the coolness of the sand beneath her feet, the patterns of the earth shifting with each step they took. She focused on the sensations, letting the world speak to her in the only way she knew. For hours, they walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of sand beneath their boots and the whisper of the wind. Zira could feel the weight of the journey ahead. The desert was vast, and they had to reach the shipwreck before the storm season hit. If they didn't make it in time, they would be stuck, stranded with no way to leave the planet. As the day wore on, the heat began to take its toll. Zira could feel the sweat dripping down her neck, the air thick and heavy. She had learned to rely on the sensations from the device. But even with that, the desert was unforgiving. The landscape blurred in her mind, the heat distorting the shapes and colors, making it harder to focus. Theo must have noticed her struggle. "We should rest for a bit," he suggested. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." Zira agreed, and they found a small patch of shade beneath a rock outcrop. They sat in silence, catching their breath. Zira drank some water from the canteen, feeling the cool liquid slide down her throat, refreshing her. "I didn't think it would be this hard," Zira said quietly, her voice full of exhaustion. Theo looked at her with a gentle smile. "The desert doesn't care about what we think. It just is. But you're stronger than you realize. I've seen you push through harder things." Zira glanced at him, grateful for his words. She had always been strong, but this was different. This journey was more than just about survival. It was about discovering a new way of seeing the world, both literally and figuratively. "Thank you," she said softly. Theo nodded. "We'll make it through this, Zira, one step at a time." They continued their journey as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert. The air was cooler now, but the journey was still long. Zira was determined to push forward, to see the shipwreck with her new perspective. But as the evening approached, something changed. Zira felt it before she heard it. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble slightly, and the wind picked up, swirling the sand around them. Theo stopped, looking around, his eyes narrowing. "What's happening?" Zira asked, a tinge of fear in her voice. "It's a sandstorm," Theo said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to find shelter. Now." Zira's heart raced. She had heard of sandstorms before, violent, fast-moving storms that could erase everything in their path. The desert was dangerous, but the storm was something else entirely. They needed to find shelter before the storm hit them full force. Theo grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the nearest rock formation. The wind howled around them, and the sand stung their skin, but they pressed on. Zira could feel the pressure of the storm building, the world around her becoming more chaotic with every passing second. The device at her temple buzzed, the sensations growing stronger, the world around her shifting faster. They reached the shelter just as the storm broke. The wind roared, the sand whipping through the air like 1,000 needles. Zira could feel the pressure of it, but she focused on the shapes around her, trying to stay grounded in the chaos. Theo pressed against the rock, pulling Zira close to shield her from the worst of the storm. The storm raged on, but Zira knew that they had made it. They were safe, at least for now. She looked up at Theo, who was watching her closely, his face full of determination. "We'll make it through," he said, his voice calm even in the middle of the storm. "We're in this together." Zira nodded, her heart filled with a new strength. She wasn't just seeing the world anymore. She was feeling it, living it. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm raged through the night, its fury relentless as the sand whipped against the rock shelter. Zira and Theo huddled together, taking shelter in the small space beneath the overhang. The wind howled above them, the storm's power shaking the ground beneath their feet. Zira could feel the vibrations in the earth, the rhythm of the storm like a pulse of energy. They had managed to find shelter just in time, and now they waited in the quiet dark, the storm's roar muffled by the thick rock above them. Zira could sense the temperature dropping as the wind howled, and she pulled her jacket closer around her, shivering slightly. Despite the cold, she felt something else, a sense of calm in the chaos. "The storm will pass soon," Theo said, his voice soft but steady as he leaned against the rock. He had his arm around Zira to keep her warm, but there was something more in his touch, something deeper. Zira felt it too. The bond between them had grown stronger in the time they had spent together, and in moments like these, it was more apparent than ever. Zira nodded, resting her head against the rock as the storm raged outside. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of the storm, not of the desert. She had Theo with her, and that was enough. "I'm glad you're here," Zira said quietly, the words coming from deep inside her. She had been alone for so long, lost in her own thoughts, always feeling like an outsider. But now, in the middle of this storm, she didn't feel alone anymore. Theo glanced at her, his eyes soft. "I'm glad I'm here too, Zira." They sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds being the wind and the occasional crackle of the sand against the rocks. Zira's mind wandered as she felt the storm's power, the way it seemed to mirror the struggles she had faced. The storm was fierce, but like the desert itself, it was a part of nature, something that couldn't be controlled, only endured. As the night wore on, the storm began to die down, the winds calming, the sand settling. Zira slowly stood up, stretching her arms, feeling the change in the air. The silence that followed was deep and peaceful, almost like the calm after the storm. "The storm is almost over," Zira said, looking out toward the desert. Theo stood beside her, his gaze following hers. "Yeah, it's clearing up. We should head out before it gets too dark." Zira nodded. They couldn't afford to waste time. The shipwreck was still out there, and they needed to find it before the next storm season arrived. She could sense the urgency in Theo's movements, the way his shoulders were tense, ready to face whatever came next. As they began walking again, the air was noticeably cooler, the storm having cleared away the heat of the day. Zira felt the weight of the journey ahead, but there was a quiet strength growing inside her. She had come so far, and though the path was uncertain, she wasn't afraid anymore. The desert was vast, but with each step, it felt smaller, more manageable. She could feel the subtle shifts in the sand beneath her feet, the change in the air with every breeze. It was as if the desert was revealing its secrets to her, things that no one else could see. Theo seemed to notice this too, glancing at her every now and then with a hint of wonder. "You're really getting the hang of it," Theo said, his voice filled with admiration. Zira smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I think I'm starting to understand it better. The world, it's not as empty as I thought. There's so much to feel, to experience." They continued walking in silence for a while, the soft crunch of their steps the only sound between them. The desert stretched out in all directions, a sea of sand and rock, but Zira no longer felt overwhelmed by it. She was no longer an outsider to the world. She was a part of it. Eventually, they reached the shipwreck. It was just as they had left it, a tangled mess of metal and debris, half buried in the sand. Zira could feel the familiar hum of the wreckage, the way it sat in the desert like a silent sentinel. Theo wasted no time, immediately starting to examine the wreckage, searching for the pieces he needed to repair his ship. Zira stood back, watching him as he worked. It was strange how familiar this place felt. The wreckage was a reminder of the crash, of everything that had happened to them. But it was also a symbol of their strength. The wreck was broken, but they were still standing. Zira had thought that she would never see the world the way others did, that she would always be different, unable to connect with what was around her. But now, with the device, she was seeing the world in a way she never thought possible. She looked at Theo, who was working intently, his hands moving quickly as he searched through the metal. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, a determination that she admired. "You've come a long way, Theo," Zira said, her voice full of respect. Theo glanced up, offering her a smile. "We've both come a long way." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. He was right. They had come a long way together. Zira walked over to him, kneeling beside him as he worked. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked. Theo paused for a moment, then nodded. "Actually, yes. I need you to keep an eye on the sand around us. The storm might have stirred things up, and we don't want any surprises." Zira nodded, her senses alert. She could feel the slightest shift in the air, the way the desert seemed to shift with the smallest movements. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the world around her speak to her through the device. For the first time, Zira felt completely connected to the desert. The way it moved, the way it lived. It was no longer just a place she was passing through. It was home. Theo finished what he was doing and stood up, stretching his arms. "I think I've got what I need," he said. Zira stood as well, looking around. "Then let's get going. The desert's waiting." And with that, they set off again, together, side by side. The world may have been vast, but it felt a little smaller now, and Zira knew that no matter what came next, she wasn't alone anymore. The journey had not been easy. The days in the desert were long, the nights colder than Zira ever imagined, and yet she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. The world, once so vast and unknown, was beginning to feel familiar, like a friend she was starting to understand. With the shipwreck repaired, they were ready to move forward. Theo had worked tirelessly, and now the ship was nearly whole again. The final touches were all that was left, and they were both eager to leave the desert behind. The vast expanse of sand and rock had tested them, but it had also taught them. Zira looked out across the desert as the sun began to rise. The light spilled across the landscape, painting the world in shades of orange and gold. For the first time, she could truly see it. The beauty of the world wasn't just in what she could touch or smell. It was in how she could feel the land beneath her feet, the movement of the air, the way the sand shifted in response to the wind. "Are you ready?" Theo asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Zira turned to see him standing beside her, the sun casting a warm glow on his face. He was tired, she could see it in his eyes, but there was a new energy about him now. The ship was almost fixed, and the weight of their journey was lifting. "I am," Zira replied, her voice steady. She felt a calmness settle over her as she spoke. She wasn't just ready to leave the desert behind. She was ready for whatever came next. Theo smiled, a weary but sincere smile. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Zira nodded. "We have, but it's not over yet." They gathered their things, preparing for the final stretch of their journey. Zira was more confident now than she had ever been. The desert was still a place of mystery, but she had learned its language, its rhythms. She had come to understand it in a way few ever would. As they made their way back to the ship, Zira felt the familiar hum of the device against her temple, the connection between her and the world stronger than ever. She could feel the desert beneath her, the wind brushing against her skin, the sky above stretching out endlessly. It was as if the world itself was alive, and she was a part of it. Theo led the way, guiding them through the last stretch of desert. The shipwreck had been in a remote part of the desert, and now they were heading back to the edge of the sand dunes, where the land met the beginning of the rocky plains. The ship was waiting for them there, a symbol of everything they had been through. When they reached the ship, Theo immediately set to work. The last few adjustments were small but necessary. Zira watched him, admiring his focus and determination. They had faced so many challenges together, but he never seemed to lose hope. "You've done it," Zira said after a while, watching as Theo finished the last of the repairs. Theo looked up from his work, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. "We've done it," he corrected her. "This wasn't just me. It was both of us." Zira smiled at his words. He was right. She had been a part of this, every step of the way. She wasn't just a passenger on this journey. She had been an active participant. The device had given her the ability to connect to the world in ways she never thought possible, and now she was using that connection to help them both. "Are you sure we're ready?" Zira asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "What comes next?" Theo stood up and walked toward her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What comes next is a new world. We're leaving this desert behind, and we're going to find out what else is out there. This ship will take us beyond the stars, Zira, to places we've never dreamed of." Zira looked at him, feeling the excitement building in her chest. She had never imagined she would leave the desert, never mind travel beyond the stars. But now, with the ship ready to go, she could almost feel the pull of the unknown. The universe was wide, and she was ready to explore it. Theo climbed into the ship first, checking the controls one last time. Zira followed, her heart racing with anticipation. She had never been in a ship before, never thought she would ever get the chance to see the stars up close. But now, it was happening. The engines hummed to life, the ship slowly lifting off the ground. Zira watched out the window as the desert shrank beneath them, the endless sea of sand becoming smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a patch of color beneath them. For the first time, Zira felt free. She wasn't bound by the earth beneath her feet or the limitations of her old life. She was no longer just a girl from a distant planet. She was someone who had seen the world through new eyes, who had felt the pulse of the universe itself. As the ship ascended, Zira looked over at Theo, who was at the controls. He met her gaze with a smile. "Are you ready for the stars?" he asked. Zira smiled back, her heart full of excitement and wonder. "I'm ready." The ship shot forward, breaking through the atmosphere and into the vastness of space. Zira looked out at the stars, the lights of distant worlds twinkling in the distance. There was so much out there, so much to discover. And now she would see it all. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Zira was no longer afraid. She had found a new purpose, a new way of seeing the universe. And as the stars stretched out before her, she knew that this was only the beginning. Together, with Theo by her side, Zira was ready to face whatever came next. The universe was vast, but now she was ready to explore it, one step at a time.